For nearly a century, one currency has dominated the global stage. The lifeblood of international commerce. The bedrock of the world's financial system. A symbol of unparalleled economic power. I'm talking, of course, about the United States dollar. Its story isn't just about economics, power, politics, the very structure of the modern world, from the bustling markets of Shanghai to the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. The dollar's influence is felt everywhere. It's the currency in which most international debts are issued, the primary medium for global trade, and the safe haven investors flock to in times of crisis. This is a privilege that has granted the United States immense advantages on the world stage for decades. The journey of the dollar to the top really began in the ashes of World War II. In 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission: build a new international economic order to prevent instability and war. With Europe and Asia in ruins, the United States stood alone as the dominant economic power. Its industrial base was untouched by war. It held the vast majority of the world's gold reserves. The decision made at Bretton Woods was almost inevitable. The US dollar, convertible to gold at $35 an ounce, would become the world's anchor currency. This arrangement, known as the Bretton Woods system, cemented the dollar's role at the heart of global finance. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar was pegged to gold. It created a stable environment for international trade and investment to flourish. For nearly 3 decades, this system worked. It fueled unprecedented global economic growth, the golden age of capitalism. The United States, as issuer of the world's reserve currency, was in a uniquely powerful position. It could essentially print money the rest of the world had to accept. This was the beginning of the dollar era. But this system wasn't destined to last forever. By the late 1960s, the costs of the Vietnam War and growing domestic spending programs put immense strain on the US economy. The country began running large deficits. The number of dollars around the world soon exceeded the value of the gold in its vaults. Other countries, particularly France, grew nervous and began demanding gold for their dollar holdings. The pressure became too much. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made a stunning announcement that severed the dollar's final link to gold. This act, known as the Nixon Shock, ended Bretton Woods but did not end the dollar's dominance. Even without the backing of gold, the dollar's reign continued. The world had become so accustomed to using it, so deeply integrated into a dollar-based system, that there was simply no immediate alternative. The so-called petrodollar system emerged, where major oil-producing nations agreed to price their oil exclusively in US dollars. This created a massive, constant global demand for American currency, further entrenching its status. For the last 50 years, this system has been the unspoken assumption of the global economy. It's allowed the United States to borrow cheaply, fund its massive trade deficits, and wield financial sanctions as a powerful tool of foreign policy. The dollar's supremacy seemed absolute and unshakable. But today, for the first time in generations, serious questions are being asked about the dollar's future. The ground beneath our feet is shifting. Geopolitical tensions are rising. The unipolar moment that followed the Cold War is clearly over. Major powers are no longer content to live in a world dominated by American financial power. China is acting to reduce dollar dependence. Russia is acting to reduce dollar dependence. They see the dollar's status not as a global public good, but as a tool of American coercion. They are actively and openly working to build an alternative financial architecture, one that is not dependent on the US dollar or the institutions that support it. This is not some distant threat, it's happening right now. This movement to de-dollarize is gaining momentum. It's visible in trade deals settled in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. It's visible in the creation of new payment systems designed to compete with the SWIFT network. Nations are diversifying their foreign exchange reserves, slowly but surely reducing their holdings of US dollars, buying more gold, buying other currencies. This is a deliberate and strategic effort by a growing coalition of countries to insulate themselves from American economic pressure, to challenge the very foundation of US global leadership. The quiet consensus that underpinned the dollar's rule is fracturing. The implications of this shift are profound and far-reaching. What happens if the world no longer needs US dollars in the same way? What happens to the United States if it loses its exorbitant privilege of printing the world's money? For the average person, this isn't just an abstract geopolitical debate. it could fundamentally change the economic reality of your daily life. It could affect the price of the gas you put in your car, the cost of the food you buy at the supermarket, the interest rates you pay on your mortgage. The era of the dollar's unquestioned dominance is facing its greatest challenge yet. We're entering a new, uncertain chapter. Is the dollar's final countdown now underway? To truly understand the dollar's power, you have to see it as more than just money. Think of it as the world's financial operating system. It's the fundamental layer upon which global commerce is built. When a Brazilian company wants to buy electronics from South Korea, the transaction is almost always conducted in US dollars. When a German car manufacturer sources parts from Malaysia, they pay in dollars. This isn't because of some legal requirement, but because of decades of established practice and, honestly, unparalleled convenience. The dollar provides a common language for trade. It eliminates complexity and risk from dozens of less stable currencies. It's become the world's default setting. This system creates a self-reinforcing loop. Because most global trade is priced in dollars, companies all over the world need to hold dollars to conduct business. This constant universal demand keeps the currency stable and liquid, which makes it the most attractive option for international transactions. It's the safest and most efficient choice. No other currency offers the same depth. No other currency offers the same stability. No other currency offers the same universal acceptance. Imagine trying to build a global business where you had to constantly manage exchange rates between Thai baht, Nigerian naira, Chilean peso. The complexity would be overwhelming. The dollar solves this problem, acting as the ultimate intermediary. This dependency extends far beyond simple trade. Critical global commodities are priced almost exclusively in dollars. Oil, the lifeblood of the industrial world. Copper, wheat, coffee, gold. Any country needing to import these essential goods must first acquire dollars to pay for them. This creates a permanent structural demand for American currency, embedded in daily global commerce. It's a system that's incredibly difficult to escape. It underpins the survival of modern economies. Therefore, the dollar's role as the primary global reserve currency is a feature of the system's design, not just history. After the Bretton Woods system ended in 1971, the world could have moved to a different standard. But it didn't. The inertia was just too powerful. The infrastructure was already built around the dollar. Banking relationships, commodity contracts, corporate accounting practices. Shifting away would require a colossal, coordinated global effort, something far more difficult than simply continuing with the status quo. The world became and largely remains a captive of the dollar's powerful network, the undisputed centerpiece of global finance. This global dependence on the dollar grants the United States a unique and powerful advantage, a benefit so significant that a French finance minister in the 1960s famously called it the exorbitant privilege. So, what is this privilege? In simple terms, it's the ability for America to buy things from the world and pay for them with money that it prints itself. While other countries must earn foreign currency through exports to pay for their imports, the United States can simply create more dollars. This allows the US to run massive trade deficits year after year, without facing the kind of economic crisis that would cripple any other nation. It's kind of like having a global credit card with no limit. This privilege has profound consequences for the US economy and its government, because there's a constant global demand for US dollars and assets like treasury bonds. The US government can borrow money at much lower interest rates than it otherwise could. Foreign governments and investors, needing a safe place to park their vast dollar reserves, eagerly buy American debt. This constant inflow of foreign capital helps finance the US government's budget deficits, funding everything from social programs to military spending. It effectively means the rest of the world is helping to finance American consumption and government operations, a subsidy of immense proportions. For the average American, this is translated into a higher standard of living than would otherwise be possible. The strong dollar makes imported goods, from electronics and clothing to cars and furniture, significantly cheaper. This has been a key factor in keeping consumer price inflation low for decades. The ability to consume more than it produces is a direct result of the dollar's global status. While this has had negative consequences for American manufacturing jobs, it's undeniably provided a direct benefit to American consumers at the checkout counter. This hidden advantage is woven into the fabric of the American economy, often taken for granted by those who benefit from it most. Furthermore, this exorbitant privilege gives the United States a powerful foreign policy tool. The ability to control the world's primary currency system allows Washington to impose powerful financial sanctions on its adversaries. By cutting off a country's access to the U.S. dollar-based financial system, the U.S. can effectively isolate it from the global economy. This financial leverage, often referred to as the weaponization of the dollar, has become a go-to instrument of American statecraft. It's a power no other country possesses, and it really underscores just how deeply intertwined the dollar's economic role is with America's geopolitical dominance on the world stage. The dollar's dominance is locked in place by something economists call a network effect. This is the same phenomenon behind social media platforms and software. The more people use a network, the more valuable it becomes, making it hard for competitors to emerge. The US dollar is the ultimate financial network. Every bank, every multinational corporation, every central bank, they have the processes, the technology, and the expertise to transact in dollars. The scale of this infrastructure creates an enormous barrier to entry. Now imagine a competitor, the Chinese yuan. It wouldn't just need to be stable and reliable. It would need millions to switch at once. Importers, exporters, investors, bankers. An Argentine company won't take yuan for beef unless those yuan can buy German machinery. The German firm will only accept yuan if it can pay its suppliers. That coordination problem is immense. No one wants to be first to move to an unproven system. US market size and depth reinforce this. Countries or big companies with billions in reserve need investments that are safe, stable, and big enough to absorb sums without disruptions. US Treasury bonds are the deepest, most liquid market. No other market offers that security and scale. That makes US government debt the premier safe haven asset, anchoring the global financial system to the dollar and the United States. Breaking free isn't one country's choice, it means unwinding a complex web built over 70 years. Any alternative must replicate the whole ecosystem. Deep liquid bond markets, a transparent legal system, established accounting standard, the trust of global market participants. So despite frustration, the world remains trapped in a dollar-denominated web. For decades, the world accepted the dollar-centric financial system as a given. But that acceptance is now being actively challenged by a powerful group of nations, who see it not as a global public good, but as a direct threat to their sovereignty and strategic ambitions. At the forefront are two major powers, China and Russia. United by a shared desire to curtail American influence, they have formed a strategic partnership aimed at chipping away at the dollar's dominance. This is an open and declared policy objective, a central pillar of their foreign policy. They are no longer willing to play by rules written by and for the United States. Russia's motivation comes from years of conflict with the West. After Ukraine, Russia faced wave after wave of US and European sanctions. Those measures tried to cut off its biggest banks from global finance and freeze its overseas assets. Moscow learned how dependence on the dollar creates vulnerability. It showed how global finance can be weaponized overnight. So Russia launched a rapid de-dollarization campaign, dumping US Treasury bonds, cutting the dollar's share in foreign trade and reserves, seeking survival outside the Western financial sphere. China's approach is strategic and long-term. As the world's largest trading nation and second biggest economy, China sees reliance on the dollar as a contradiction. Why should global trade be settled in the currency of a geopolitical rival? Beijing wants to internationalize the yuan and reshape the global financial system to match its economic weight. This is patient, methodical work. Promote the yuan in trade finance, set up currency swap lines with dozens of countries, build its own financial infrastructure. Together, Sino-Russian ties form a powerful axis for de-dollarization. Russia brings political impetus and willingness to be disruptive. China brings scale and tech to build an alternative. They encourage other nations, especially in the global south, to join. They promote trade in local currencies, develop new payment systems, and create forums like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to coordinate strategies. This Eastern alliance is the most organized challenge the dollar has faced since it rose to supremacy. The push for de-dollarization is not just a bilateral project between Russia and China, it's expanding into a broader coalition of emerging economies, most notably through the BRICS bloc: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran. This collection of nations now represents a significant portion of the world's population, economic output, and crucially its energy production. Their shared goal is to restructure the global financial order, to give a greater voice to the developing world, and reduce their collective dependence on the dollar. IMF. World Bank. A key part of their strategy is to build a parallel financial universe, an alternative set of institutions to rival the existing ones. The most prominent example is the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank. Founded in 2014, the NDB's mission is to fund infrastructure and sustainable development projects in member countries. Crucially, it aims to provide a growing share of its loans in local currencies rather than US dollars. This allows developing nations to borrow for critical projects without exposing themselves to the risks of a fluctuating dollar exchange rates, a problem that has plagued emerging markets for decades. It is a direct challenge to the lending dominance of Washington-based institutions. Beyond banking, the BRICS nations are actively working on creating alternative payment systems. The goal is to build a network that can bypass SWIFT, the Belgium-based messaging system that underpins most international bank transfers. While SWIFT is technically neutral, its alignment with Western interests means it can be used to enforce sanctions, as Russia discovered when many of its banks were cut off. In response, Russia developed its system for transfer of financial messages. China has its cross-border interbank payment system. The ultimate goal is to link these national systems together, creating a robust and sanction-proof network for BRICS members to transact directly with one another. This is a monumental undertaking, and honestly it's still in its early stages. The UN, for example, still only accounts for a small fraction of global payments, and the financial markets of BRICS countries lack the depth and liquidity of the United States. However, the political will is undeniable and the momentum is growing. By settling more trade in their own currencies, Indian rupees for Russian oil, Chinese yuan for Saudi crude, each transaction that bypasses the dollar, no matter how small, helps to build the muscle memory and infrastructure for a new system. They are laying the bricks one by one for a new financial architecture. Nothing has accelerated the global push for de-dollarization more than America's own actions. In recent years, the United States has increasingly turned to its financial power as its primary tool of foreign policy. The weaponization of the dollar, through sweeping economic sanctions, has become a go-to strategy for punishing adversaries. Visual: a US dollar bill wrapped in chains with a padlock. While effective in the short term, this approach has had profound, maybe even unintended long-term consequences, making countries all over the world deeply nervous about their own vulnerability. It served as a powerful advertisement for alternatives to the dollar-based system. The decision to freeze nearly $300 billion of the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine was a turning point. This was a move of unprecedented scale against a major world economy. For officials in Beijing, if it can happen to Russia, it can happen to us. For officials in Riyadh, if it can happen to Russia, it can happen to us. For officials in Brasilia, if it can happen to Russia, it can happen to us. The idea that foreign reserves could be seized overnight sent a shockwave through the global financial community. It fundamentally undermined the perception of US dollar assets as a safe, neutral haven for the world's savings. This aggressive use of sanctions has pushed even traditional US partners to begin quietly hedging their bets. They might not be openly challenging the United States, but they are definitely taking practical steps to reduce their exposure. Central banks are diversifying their reserves. Central banks are buying record amounts of gold. They're exploring digital currencies. They're setting up more bilateral currency swap lines to facilitate non-dollar trade. The fear isn't necessarily of being an adversary to the US today, but of potentially falling out of favor tomorrow. The weaponization of finance has turned dollar dependence from a simple economic reality into a significant strategic liability. In essence, the United States is facing a classic strategic dilemma. The very tool that gives it immense power today, the ability to control access to the global dollar system, is simultaneously fueling the long-term effort to create a world where that tool is no longer effective. Every time a new sanction is announced, it serves as another reminder to the rest of the world why they need to de-dollarize. This has created a powerful incentive for a diverse array of countries to collaborate on building an escape route. The more the dollar is used as a weapon, the faster the world will work to build a shield against it, accelerating the very trend that threatens America's exorbitant privilege. The end of the dollar's undisputed reign would signal more than just an economic shift. It would fundamentally redraw the map of global power. For decades, America's geopolitical influence has been inextricably linked to its financial supremacy. The dollar has acted as a kind of gravitational force, pulling nations into Washington's orbit. Countries that rely on the dollar for trade, finance, and their own economic stability have a powerful, built-in incentive to align with U.S. foreign policy objectives. This financial dependency has served as a form of soft power, creating a global order under an American security umbrella. A world less dependent on the dollar is a world where this umbrella begins to fray at the edges, and America's ability to lead and influence is significantly diminished. In a world where the dollar is no longer the default currency, the United States would lose its automatic seat at the head of the global table. Its ability to project power would be constrained. Think of the U.S. military presence around the world, sustained by the ability to fund vast defense budgets through cheap borrowing. If global demand for U.S. debt falters, borrowing costs would inevitably rise, forcing a difficult national conversation about guns versus butter. A weaker dollar would make it more expensive to maintain overseas bases and fund international alliances. Allies might begin to question the reliability of U.S. security guarantees, potentially seeking greater strategic autonomy or aligning with new rising powers. This new geopolitical landscape would likely be far more fragmented and contested. Regional powers would feel emboldened to assert influence without fear of U.S. financial retribution. We could see distinct spheres of influence centered around dominant regional currencies, a UN bloc in Asia, a Euro bloc in Europe. This could lead to a more competitive and potentially more unstable international environment. Without a single dominant power to enforce rules, disputes over trade, territory, and resources could become more frequent and harder to resolve. The era of a US-led globalized world could give way to intense regional rivalries. The nature of international diplomacy would change. Many global crises are currently managed through financial leverage by the US Treasury Department. In a post-dollar world, that tool would be far less effective. The US would need to rely more on traditional diplomacy, persuasion, and military force, all costlier and more complex than sanctions. America would have to negotiate its position, becoming one power among several. This would be the greatest shift in global power dynamics since the end of the Cold War. One of the most immediate and tangible consequences of a de-dollarized world would be the blunting of America's most potent foreign policy weapon: economic sanctions. For years, the US has used economic sanctions as its most potent foreign policy tool. That power comes from control over the dollar-based financial system: Iran, North Korea, Russia, the ability to cut a country off from the SWIFT messaging system, or freeze its central bank reserves. That power instills fear and commands compliance. It allows the United States to wage economic warfare without firing a single shot. This financial leverage has been a cornerstone of American statecraft. It offers a powerful alternative to military intervention. But a decline in the dollar's dominance would render this weapon increasingly obsolete. Imagine a future where the BRICS nations build an alternative payment system: Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Riyadh, a network connecting Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Riyadh without ever touching a US bank. A US president could announce the toughest sanctions imaginable. But for countries in that parallel system, it would be like shouting into the void. They could continue to trade, they could continue to invest, they could continue to transfer funds among themselves. The US would lose its ability to act as the world's financial gatekeeper. This would embolden current adversaries and change the strategic calculus for other nations considering divergent policies. That loss of leverage presents a stark and uncomfortable choice for future US policymakers. When faced with a foreign policy crisis, what options would remain? Without sanctions as a middle option, the choice could be ineffective diplomacy or direct military conflict. That's a far more dangerous and volatile world. The ability to apply calibrated economic pressure allows for nuance and escalation control. Remove that tool, and the US may have to accept outcomes it deems unacceptable, or risk being drawn into costly bloody wars. The decline of the dollar has profound implications for global peace and stability. Furthermore, the very threat of sanctions would lose its deterrent effect. Much of America's influence comes from the implicit threat that sanctions could be imposed. That threat encourages countries to self-censor and align with Washington's preferences. As alternative financial systems grow and become viable, that deterrent will fade. Nations will feel bolder pursuing their own interests, knowing they have a financial escape hatch. The fear that underpinned much of the post-Cold War order would dissipate, leaving the United States with far fewer levers to shape global events. The decline of a single dominant currency wouldn't necessarily mean that another one just steps in to take its place. Instead, the most likely outcome is a multipolar monetary world, with several competing currency blocks. This would actually be a return to a historical norm. Think of the world before World War II, British pound sterling, French franc, the dollar. In this new era, we could see the emergence of a US dollar bloc, a Chinese yuan bloc, a euro bloc. Global trade and finance would get a lot more complicated. Think of it as a patchwork of regional systems. In this fragmented world, international commerce would be fundamentally different. A business in Southeast Asia, for example, might price its exports to China in yuan, its exports to Europe in euros, its exports to the Americas in dollars. Companies would need a whole new level of sophistication in managing currency risk. The simplicity and efficiency of the current dollar-based system would be lost, replaced by a more friction-filled environment. Nations would start aligning with different currency blocks based on trade and geopolitics. That would create new economic fault lines. Your country's choice of currency anchor could become as important as its military alliances. This competition wouldn't just be about economics, it would be a battle for influence and power. The country at the center of each bloc, the US, China, the European Union, would gain what's often called the exorbitant privilege. They'd borrow more cheaply within their bloc and wield regional financial influence. But this could also lead to a new form of economic colonialism. Smaller nations financially dependent on powerhouses. The rules of global finance, from banking regulations to accounting standards, could start to diverge. For the United States, this transition would be a tough adjustment. It would have to compete for financial influence like it hasn't in nearly 80 years. The dollar would need to stay attractive, stable, and well-managed to keep its position. Losing universal default status means the US would actually have to earn its currency's place in the world. This multipolar system would be a daily referendum on American economic governance. The shift from a unipolar to multipolar financial world would be a clear sign that America's era of unchallenged global leadership has, well, truly come to an end. For decades, Americans have actually enjoyed a hidden subsidy, a global discount on almost everything they buy. This has been a direct benefit of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. Because the dollar is strong and in high demand globally, it just has more purchasing power. That means goods produced in other countries, smartphones, TVs, clothing from Latin America, wine from Europe. All of those things are a lot cheaper for American consumers. This exorbitant privilege has been a cornerstone of the American lifestyle, letting people enjoy a level of consumption disconnected from the nation's actual productive output. It's a benefit most folks don't even realize they have, but wow, they'd notice it right away if it disappeared. In a de-dollarized world, this fundamental advantage just evaporates. If global demand for the dollar were to fall significantly, the dollar's value compared to other currencies would drop. A weaker dollar means it would take more dollars to buy the same goods from other countries. The price of imported products on the shelves of American stores would inevitably rise. That new television? It might cost 20% more. The price of your favorite coffee, the one from Colombia, could jump. The cost of a new car, packed with components from all over the world, would go up. And here's the thing. This isn't just a temporary spike. It's a permanent repricing of America's relationship with the global marketplace. The era of cheap imports would be over. This would feel like a sudden and persistent bout of inflation for a lot of households. A direct hit to the family budget. The purchasing power of your salary would shrink. The cost of living would rise, not because of something happening in Washington, but because the United States would no longer be able to buy the world's goods at a discount. This would force a tough adjustment for a society used to abundance and low prices. Families would have to make harder choices about spending, and the standard of living could decline. The global credit card would finally be maxed out, and the bill would come due for the average American consumer. But it wouldn't just stop at consumer goods. The price of gasoline would be one of the first and most noticeable changes. Oil is priced in dollars on the global market. If the dollar weakens, the price of a barrel of oil in dollars has to go up to keep its value for producers in places like Saudi Arabia or Russia. That increase would hit consumers directly at the pump. A world where the dollar is just one currency among many is a world where Americans would have to pay the true, unsubsidized cost for energy. This single change would ripple through every part of life, making everything that needs to be transported more expensive. The dollar's global dominance made goods cheaper and borrowing money incredibly cheap for Americans. Central banks and investors need a safe place to store reserves, so they flock to buy U.S. government debt, treasury bonds. That constant demand kept interest rates low for decades. These low government borrowing rates set the economy's benchmark. They influence mortgages, they influence car loans, they influence student loans, they influence credit card debt. The low mortgage rates of the past 2 decades are a consequence of the dollar's status. Now imagine this in reverse. Appetite for U.S. treasuries would diminish. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, fewer dollars to recycle, less incentive to park money in American debt. The U.S. would have to offer higher interest rates to attract capital. The government's borrowing cost rises and causes immediate knock-on effects. The era of cheap money would end, and borrowing costs would rise for everyone. For the average person, this would be a profound shock. The dream of homeownership becomes far more distant. A mortgage of 3% versus 7 or 8% can add hundreds or even thousands to a monthly payment, making homeownership unaffordable for many. The cost of financing a car would soar. Credit card interest would become even more punishing. This isn't just an inconvenience, it would fundamentally alter the financial landscape, making it much harder to finance major life purchases and build wealth over time. Higher borrowing costs would also put immense pressure on the U.S. government. For years, the government ran massive deficits without immediate consequence, but with higher interest rates, servicing the national debt would explode. That would force incredibly difficult political choices. Raise taxes, slash spending, Social Security, slash spending, Medicare, cut back on defense. The exorbitant privilege that let America avoid these choices would be gone, leading to intense political and social conflict. The combination of more expensive imports and higher borrowing costs would lead to a new economic environment defined by a force that the U.S. has largely kept at bay for 40 years: persistent, structural inflation. The low inflation of the past few decades was not an accident. It was the deflationary pressure of cheap imported goods from countries like China and the Federal Reserve's ability to manage the economy with low interest rates. A decline in the dollar's global status would dismantle those pillars, creating a perfect storm for higher prices across the board, a shift much harder to control than the cyclical inflation we've seen recently. A weaker dollar would mean finished imported goods become more expensive, and so would all the raw materials and intermediate components American factories use. Imagine a US-based company that makes furniture. It would pay more for imported wood, imported screws, imported fabric. A food processor would pay more for imported spices or for packaging materials. These higher costs would be passed on to consumers as higher prices for American-made products. Even buying made in the USA would not offer an escape from rising prices. Inflation would become embedded in the domestic supply chain, a durable long-term challenge. At the same time, the Federal Reserve's ability to fight this inflation would be severely handicapped. In the past, when inflation rose, the Fed could raise interest rates to cool down the economy. But in a post-dollar world, interest rates would already be starting from a much higher baseline due to the government's increased borrowing costs. Pushing rates even higher to combat inflation would risk tipping an already fragile economy into a deep recession, and would make the government's debt problem even worse. The Fed would be trapped, facing a terrible choice between controlling inflation and causing a severe economic downturn. Its policy tools would become far less effective. For ordinary people, this would feel like running on a treadmill that is constantly speeding up. Wages might rise, but they would struggle to keep pace with the relentless increase in the cost of living. Savings would lose their value more quickly, making it harder to plan for retirement or save for a child's education. The economic stability and predictability that have been the hallmark of the U.S. economy for generations would be replaced by a new era of uncertainty and financial anxiety. The end of the dollar's reign would not just be a story for the financial news, it would be a lived reality that reshapes the economic fortunes of every single American. We stand at a pivotal moment in economic history, a potential turning point that could redefine the global order for generations to come. The United States dollar, the undisputed king of currencies for nearly 80 years, is facing the most significant and coordinated challenge to its reign. This is not a manufactured crisis or a distant academic debate. It is the logical culmination of deep-seated geopolitical shifts, the rise of new powers with different ambitions, and the consequences of America's own policy choices. The de-dollarization movement, driven by rivals like China, Russia, and embraced by a growing coalition of nations in the global south, is no longer a theoretical possibility. It is a slow-motion reality, unfolding before our very eyes. The supremacy of the dollar was never guaranteed to last forever. History teaches us that the lifespan of a reserve currency is finite. Portuguese real, Spanish dollar, Dutch guilder, British pound sterling. The dollar's long tenure has been a product of a unique set of historical circumstances: America's post-war industrial might, the depth of its financial markets, and the broad acceptance of its political leadership. As these underlying conditions change, the currency system built upon them faces pressure. The world of 2024 is not the world of 1944, and the financial architecture is beginning to reflect that new reality. The question is no longer if the dollar's role will change, but how and how fast. Will it be a gradual, managed evolution toward a more multipolar currency system, where the dollar shares the stage with the euro and the yuan? Or could it be a rapid, disorderly collapse triggered by a geopolitical crisis or a loss of faith in America's ability to manage its own finances? The path ahead is not preordained. It will be shaped by the decisions made in Washington, Beijing, and other capitals around the world. For the United States, this moment presents a profound choice: to defensively cling to the privileges of the past or to proactively adapt to the realities of the future. This is fundamentally a challenge to American leadership and economic stewardship. The factors that will determine the dollar's fate are now clear. Can the United States get its own fiscal house in order, tackling its soaring national debt? Can it wield its financial power with more restraint, reassuring the world that the dollar system is a global public utility, not just a tool of American foreign policy? Can it foster the innovation and economic dynamism needed to ensure its markets remain the most attractive and reliable in the world? The answers to these questions will determine whether the dollar's story ends with a managed decline or a catastrophic fall, shaping the economic destiny of every American in the process. As we look to the horizon, it is clear that we are sailing into uncharted waters. The unipolar moment, where a single currency and a single power set the terms for the entire globe, is drawing to a close. We are witnessing the dawn of a new, more complex, and likely more competitive economic era. A future with multiple powerful currency blocks, centered on the dollar, the euro, and the yuan, seems increasingly plausible. This world would be one of greater friction, where global commerce is not as seamless and the geopolitical landscape is more fragmented. It would be a world that demands a new way of thinking from policymakers, businesses, and citizens alike, forcing an adjustment after decades of dollar-centric stability. This transition will not happen overnight. The dollar's dominance is supported by the immense inertia of the global financial system. Its deep, liquid markets, the trust in U.S. institutions, and the powerful network effects we have discussed are enormous advantages that no challenger can replicate quickly. The dollar will likely remain the most important currency for the foreseeable future, but its relative power will almost certainly diminish. The trend is clear. Nations are diversifying reserves, they are seeking non-dollar trade settlement, and they are building the infrastructure for a world less dependent on a single currency. The journey has begun, and the destination is a world where America's exorbitant privilege is either reduced or gone entirely. For the individual, this abstract geopolitical shift will have concrete, tangible consequences. It signals a future where the cost of imported goods may be permanently higher, where borrowing money for a home becomes more expensive, or a car becomes more expensive, and where economic stability is less of a given. It requires a new level of financial literacy and resilience. The hidden benefits that Americans have enjoyed for generations are not guaranteed to continue. Understanding this transition is the first step toward preparing for it. This is not a call for panic, but a call for awareness. The economic assumptions that have defined the post-war era are being rewritten, and we must all learn to read the new script. Ultimately, the story of the dollar is a story about power, trust, and the ever-shifting tides of history. Its rise was a testament to American strength and ingenuity. Its potential decline is a reflection of a changing world, one with new centers of gravity and new aspirations. Whether this transition leads to a more balanced and equitable global system or a more chaotic and conflict-ridden one remains to be seen. What is certain is that the final countdown, in whatever form it takes, has started. The world is changing and the dollar's place within it will never be the same. The great challenge of our time will be to navigate this historic transformation with wisdom and foresight.